Hello, students. So I'll be discussing Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is titled Research Design. And I'm really going to be talking about a couple of different questions. So I thought it'd be good to talk about two different parts of Chapter 5, control methods and design selection for research process. So the chapter describes 5 methods of establishing control. So, for example, there's manipulation, elimination, inclusion, statistical control, and randomization. Provide an example, if you want to, as a student, of a research question where you use at least 3 of these methods and explain the choice you're making. Another type of question that I was thinking I could speak to you about was about design selection. So let's say, for example, you want to study the effectiveness of a new community policing program on crime rates. Which research design would you choose from in discussing the chapter, and what are the key strengths and limitations, the pros and cons? So, for example, if we talk about effectiveness of a community policing program, for me personally, I would probably choose a quasi-experimental type of design, specifically around the non-equivalent group design, which Bhattacharya discusses in the chapter. I think this is the best choice because it allows the researcher to study cases of cause and effect in a real-world setting without requiring random assignment, which is very difficult to do in the real world, and especially in policing. In law enforcement, for example, when you have decisions about deployment, which are shaped by staffing levels, call volume, leadership priorities, and community needs, a true experiment may be stronger in theory but difficult to carry out in practice. So if you were to use a design like I've provided you, you would compare crime rates in one area where the community policing program is implemented in a similar area where it is not implemented. You'd have to compare cause and effect, the pros and cons, so to speak. You'd also examine both crime trends in both locations, both before the program starts and after the program ends. One strength, of course, with this approach is that it is more convincing than a simple before and after comparison in one neighborhood because it includes a comparison group. That's very important to understand. If you don't have a good comparison group, you can't really come up with effective research for these types of questions. So I've had some students who work in law enforcement, including in this program, policing and such. And crime patterns, they've told me, and research shows this, they can shift over time. For example, geographically, things shift over. Weather is a good example about that. Oftentimes, homicides and other violent crimes will rise in the summer and fall in the winter, mainly because people just don't feel like getting out of their houses in the winter. So they may get upset with somebody on the computer or on the phone, but it's snowing outside or it's very cold and rainy outside. And like, yeah, I want to see that guy in June at the family barbecue, my brother. So no, I'm just kidding. Please don't do that. please don't do that. But that's generally what happens, actually. There's many different reasons. There's staffing shortages. People quit. They could be flu season. There's also repeat offenders. There's seasonal trends, like I mentioned before. But that design that you make as a researcher, it helps to account for some of that complexity while still remaining practical for public policy, public administration research. The main limitation is that those two groups may not be truly equivalent, even if they can appear similar at first. One area may have different social conditions, offender patterns, or levels of community trust. The community trust may be very different in one neighborhood A versus neighborhood B. And that influences crime outcomes and influences all of crime. Bhattacharya, of course, also discusses this in the chapter, that the quasi-experimental designs are useful when true experiments are not feasible, but they do not provide the same level of control. Overall, I would still choose design for myself personally, because it does offer the best balance of rigor and realism when evaluating the community policing strategy as an example. There could be different ones. There's also another example I would like to discuss a little bit would be like selection bias. Selection bias is a very significant issue because certain neighborhoods that are selected for this program that we've discussed, it may differ systematically from those that are not. For example, you could have an instance or an intervention where it may be more likely to be implemented in areas with high crime rates than those with lower crime rates, which could become more difficult to interpret the findings. The parallel trends assumption, which states that both the treatment and the control group would have followed comparable trends over time in the absence of the program, is another drawback. The estimated effects could be skewed if this assumption is false. Furthermore, another idea to think about for students as we wrap up this discussion is that outside variables could also affect crime rates, and as such, it can definitely skew the results, such as there's new legislation, new policies passed, new laws, changes in the economy, or modifications to police tactics. There could be things that occur like that. If we were to talk about control methods, and which is the chapter 5 discusses this, where there's 5 methods of establishing control: manipulation, elimination, inclusion, statistical control, and randomization. Establishing control is very critical, right, in research is to ascertain whether the relationship between variables is genuinely causal or it's a consequence of external factors. So if we were to consider this a novel approach to teaching, does it also raise high school students' math scores in comparison to a different type of conventional approach? A researcher could then use a variety of control techniques, such as manipulation, randomization, inclusion, elimination, to successfully address this question. So, for example, we start with manipulation as a method for establishing control. Manipulation is generally employed because the independent variable in this case, the teaching strategy, is actively introduced by the researcher. While one group of students continues to receive instruction using conventional method, another group is then taught using the new teaching strategy. The researcher can directly then determine whether the teaching style affects student performance by carefully selecting which participants receive each method. Second, the second type of establishing control research method. In order to account for students of individual differences, you can use randomization as a tool. The experimental group and the control group are assigned at random to participants, so even the researcher may not really know sometimes. This procedure aids in ensuring that the elements like motivation, prior knowledge, learning capacity among the students are distributed equally between the two groups. Because of this, any variations in results are more likely to be ascribed to the teaching strategy than to inherent student differences. Third, inclusion then is implemented by measuring and statistically adjusting for pertinent factors that might influence test results. For example, the researcher could then gather information on the socioeconomic status, attendance history, prior math grades of the students. The researcher can then account for all these variables' possible influence by incorporating them into the analysis. By lessening the influence of confounding variables that randomization cannot completely control, this then improves the study. Finally, students should consider this. Elimination is also used to lower the sample's needless variability. Participants in the study program for the math program could be restricted by the researcher to students in the same grade level. So, for example, Algebra 2 students in 9th grade or 10th grade, depending when you take algebra. I think I took algebra grade 1 and grade 9, and then algebra part 2 in grade 10, but it depends on the school, I suppose. Together, of course, this eliminates variations in curriculum complexity or developmental stage, which then improves the accuracy of group comparisons. Now, in conclusion, looking at this research study as a hypothetical for the math program I'm discussing, its internal validity is then improved by employing a variety of control techniques, including the manipulation, randomization, inclusion, and elimination. And together, these four tools, they offer a more accurate evaluation of whether the new teaching method actually enhances math performance, because each approach tackles potential sources of bias in a different way. So that should give you guys all a good example, a good understanding of Chapter 5 and the 5 parts I discussed, along with the policing strategy. And I hope that it was useful to understand, and I hope that I will see you in my next video. And I want to thank you again for your time that you gave me today. Thank you.